Thank you. I wanted to speak about Jihadi-Salafism and violence. I will be summing up a lot of the key arguments and findings of my book. I'm a historian by training, and what I wanted to do when I started to look at this topic was to answer that question that a lot of people have been asking ever since September the 11th, really, which is, what do these guys believe? What is it that's really driving them? A lot of the books that have looked at jihadi violence and have looked at the jihadi movement in general have been sort of based around the personalities, based around the attacks. So it's very much a case of, bin Laden met with this individual in this part of the world, and these various attacks were planned as a result of that. I'm less interested in the personalities in that sense. What I'm interested in is the ideas. How did certain ideas come into existence? How were they shaped? How were those ideas then fashioned into this sort of fairly aggressive doctrine that we have seen really only gain momentum in that post 9/11 climate and take root, of course, most dramatically in the Syrian conflict with the rise of Islamic State and its self-declared caliphate. So in order to do that, I thought I'd break into 6 broad parts to essentially explain this idea of who are the Salafs, so who are the Salafis, what is the background to this movement, and then what is Salafi Jihadism in that sort of context, to contextualize that. And then, because the theme of what you've been discussing now, I think for the last 4 days, is to look at that dynamic between religion and violence, was to pick up on 3 core ideas that are important to the Salafi Jihadi movement in terms of how they have constructed and created this warrior doctrine in terms of their understanding to have a kind of legal or set of legal principles that define their war. And to that end, it is worth saying that even this ultra-violence that we see, this nihilism, this barbarism, isn't the product of some kind of whimsical fancy. There is a broader framework of ideas, of law, of canon that sort of sits around what they're doing, that informs their movement, albeit you could say the construction of which is somewhat sporadic, but nonetheless there is a framework there. So what is this term, Salaf or Salafi? And it literally means the Salaf Salih, the pious predecessors. And to that end, it's a sort of philosophical worldview about how do I lead, how do I live the best Muslim life possible? How can I be the best Muslim that I can possibly be? And so this sort of pious predecessor era really refers to the first 3 generations of Islam that surrounded the Prophet Muhammad. So it's his companions, the Sahaba, and the children of the companions, the Tabi'een, and then the Tabi'een, the grandchildren. And those first 3 generations that surrounded the Prophet Muhammad are regarded as this sort of golden era of authenticity, of piety, of the sort of best and most virtuous Muslims around. And given that in matters of religion, Muslims believe that the Prophet Muhammad is perfect and therefore you can't attain that for yourself because he's chosen by God, you can achieve the piety of the companions that were around him and the others because these were ordinary individuals. And so you try to emulate them in that way. So it's this kind of revivalist doctrine really that's saying by moving backwards, by regressing to this rather conservative literalist interpretation, we're actually progressing because we're moving back towards this era of greater authenticity, back towards this era of greater purity of doctrinal understanding of the religion in that sense. And this is all based around a hadith, and it's worth just momentarily at least explaining what the hadith are. So there's sort of secondary body of law that sits alongside the Quran. I sort of sometimes tell my students to think about it as footnotes to the Quran that sort of sits there along with it. And these are the recorded traditions of the Prophet Muhammad, including words, actions, habits, and so on. Now there is a lot of science and study that goes on around the hadith, but the point was that the Prophet Muhammad was asked, who are the best Muslims? And he said, the generation around me, the companions, and then the generation after them, and then the generation after them. So those first 3 generations are taken in that context of being that, or representing at least that era of authenticity and purity and of the best Islam, as it were, around. And as a result, you have revivalist movements today that want to go back and emulate that. And these are people who, if you saw them on the street, at least are most obviously, visibly, identifiably Muslim. They will wear robes, usually have long beards and so on. So they're kind of identifiably Muslim in an obvious sense. And that sort of sets up that notion of the sort of Salafi, you could say, ideal. So we're saying as well that there are sort of these various ideas in that notion of Salafism and how to go back towards it, of which the most sort of common phrase, and these terms get used interchangeably, is Wahhabism and Salafism. And so we're saying they're not the same. If you think of it in this way, it sort of helps clarify in your mind. Salafism is the philosophical view, right? It's that philosophical ideal of how to be the best Muslim you can be, how to lead the good Muslim life. And Wahhabism, or the doctrine of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, is a methodology for realizing that vision. But not all Salafis follow his views. But clearly, because of its adoption by the Saudi state, it's popularizing around the world as a result, it's the best known method, you could say, and therefore probably the most widely followed method as a result. It's also worth saying that Salafism is conflated by and large in public debate with extremism, and in and of itself, that's not strictly accurate. Salafis are conservatives, but it's a very, very broad movement. And within it, there are lots of different traditions. There's a very good American scholar, Quentin McGill, who actually had this sort of notion of sort of stratifying Salafism into three broad strains. And I think it is conceptually useful for these purposes, at least, to sort of look at it in that sense, which is the majority of Salafis are quietists. They're politically inert. They're not concerned with changing the world, with changing their societies. They're really very inward-looking. They're concerned about themselves and getting themselves and their families to paradise. And as a result, focus in on themselves. They believe in education and purification. That's really what it is for themselves. Learn more about the religion and implement it and become a better Muslim. And that's, by and large, what they're sort of seeking to do. You have another category of politicos, sort of politically active Salafis, so-called Sahwa Salafis, awakening Salafis. And what these guys do, and you tend to find them more concentrated in the Gulf, you don't really find them in the West, is that they have a relationship with their governments of being essentially friendly critics. They needle the government, they campaign for change, they call for change, but they don't advocate violent opposition to the state. They, by and large, actually don't encourage social unrest at all, but they do prod and probe and sort of highlight the excesses or the shortcomings of the regimes before trying to advocate a different opinion. And so a really good example of that is a Saudi cleric called Salman al-Auda, who's actually been arrested in the latest series of crackdowns that happened towards the end of last year. But when the 2011 Arab uprisings took place, he published an important document. It's more or less, for the world, but it's really speaking to a Saudi audience heavily and specifically. And what it's saying is, look, you have legitimate grievances. You have legitimate sets of concerns and things you want to campaign for and so on, and these are fine, these are good, these are admirable things to go for. You should continue to do that, but don't come out on the streets and protest in the way that we've seen in Egypt, in Libya, or Tunisia. Don't follow that model. That's not the right way to do this. At the same time, in the same document, he's addressing the royal family and King Abdullah, who was king at that moment, and saying to him, you've seen the popular uprisings elsewhere. You've seen this sort of boiling over of sentiment and emotion for people. And as a result, you can't hold back the tide forever. We're telling people not to come out on the streets. We're telling them not to disrupt the social order. But if you don't give people concessions, if you don't move towards reforms in some shape or manner, then the dam will burst eventually. So he's telling both sides, you have rights and responsibilities, you have obligations, you have things you need to do, you have considerations that you have to factor into your political thinking. And so he's trying to create, in a sense, this kind of interesting social contract and create a kind of Salafist model of dissent and political engagement with the state, which I think is very, very interesting, and it'll, I think, only grow in prominence and importance over the coming years in that region, particularly as Saudi Arabia, under Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman at least, begins to implement his various and ambitious programs. Then you will find the religious establishment wanting to engage, wanting to try and carve out things for itself. And so I think this idea of the activist Salafism model is something we will continue to see grow in that region and in that way. But what we're really interested in is that third category. It's the violent rejectionist Salafi Jihadi movement, and that's ultimately what I'm going to spend the rest of my time talking to you about. And what I argue in my book and what I found in my research is that there are 5 core operational ideas that define this movement. And in that context, I think it's worth saying these are not ideas that are unique. Right? They are normative concepts within Islam. But what I wanted to do in my book, and what I've tried to do, is to stay away from value judgments. What is good theology? What is bad theology? What is the correct interpretation of one doctrine or piece of scripture versus an incorrect interpretation? I don't think that's the role clearly a scholar should be playing in this. That's for imams, and that's for people who are engaged in that sort of activist side of things to be doing. But what I did want to do was to take these ideas and to discuss them from the perspective of what has the Salafi Jihadi movement done in its construction of these ideas that is unique to its understanding of them. And it's that bit that's very interesting, because if you look at the 4th point, Tawheed, then actually Tawheed is, if you were going to say in one word, what is Islam all about? It's that. You can't be a Muslim without believing in that concept. So the fact it's there is not to say this is controversial. It's not to say there's something violent about this idea. It's to say this is a foundational, a core aspect, intellectual aspect of Islam, and the Salafi Jihadi movement has a particular and a unique understanding of it. And that's what I was interested in. So I will go through those ideas relatively quickly for you, and then, as I say, I'll come back to jihad to discuss what specific things the movement has done in its construction of that idea, which I think are quite interesting in helping us better contextualize and understand the kind of violence we've seen play out then in places like Syria, Iraq, and more broadly around the world as well. So also worth saying before I proceed, if you look at the first 3 ideas, they're certainly much more operational, they're much more relevant for fighters on the ground. So if you are a member of ISIS running around Syria and Iraq, those first 3 ideas play out much more importantly for you on a day-to-day basis than the latter 2. As a result, when I was doing my research, when I was compiling all the documents that I sort of used to form my insights, there is stacks of material on the first 3, because those are the 3 ideas, if you're a leading member of Al-Qaeda in Iraq in 2003, that you need to convince other Muslims about to justify why you've just pulled off a huge bombing in a marketplace in Baghdad, or why you're trying to force a sectarian war against the Shia, or why you're trying to do something else. So those 3 ideas get a lot of attention, because essentially they're the ones you need to sell in order to drive forward your agenda. The latter 2 you don't find are that relevant in that way. And so you find different theorists playing a role there, more so older texts, because the terms of trade are largely set. But in the first 3, not only do you get a lot of literature, but you get this very interesting split within the jihadi movement itself between theorists of the jihadi movement who think about it, who write about it, but aren't actually on the ground. So they can create the intellectual perfect battlefield and say, this is how war should be fought. Versus those on the ground who are having to create an ad hoc, real-time theology to advance their cause, of course, in an imperfect world where they're fighting asymmetrically and therefore can't can't give themselves the luxury of those ideal circumstances that the theorists think about. So the first point when we think about jihad, of course, is that for the movement in particular, it says jihad is a form of worship. This is a ritualistic act, just like other ritual acts in Islam, fasting, praying, going on pilgrimage. It's the same thing. They try to elevate it to that concept to say, look, not only is it an act of worship, it's actually one of the highest forms of worship. You should absolutely, therefore, be engaging in jihad in order to make that a reality. And as a result of that idea being popularized, being given more support, we began to see a series of irregular mobilizations from the 1980s, of course, at that point with the campaign against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. It's the latter point that I'll come back to in a bit, which is this notion of qisas, this doctrine of personal injury, and the way it's been used and elevated into a doctrine that's been used by the group to apply to international relations when it never really did. It was very much about personal injury and this sort of the law of equal retaliation in that concept. So it's really about a sort of restoration in that sense, but they used it in a very different context. Takfir is obviously a huge, so this is a popular picture. I was trying to find ways to illustrate these concepts because there's no easy way to do it. But takfir is the concept of excommunication. It's fundamentally the idea that is driving, or the intellectual concept that is driving the sectarian conflict that we're seeing now in the Levant, in particular, in a very dynamic form. But again, we've seen play out in a number of countries around the world as well. And this idea, of course, traces its roots back to the early history of Islam. It has existed, obviously, since the earliest days, with periodic moments of outbursts. And I think it's fair to say that that idea of Sunnis and Muslims living side by side has happened peacefully for many years. Not necessarily happily, but there's been a sort of uncomfortable neighbors scenario which has persisted, and then you get these conflagrations and these sort of bursts of violence when they occur in response to essentially the idea that there's a political prize to be won at the end of that process. And you see that happening very much today in Syria and Iraq. There is a sense that there is a prize to be won at the end of this. There is something to be gained at the end of that tunnel, and as a result of that, you do see this violence. And it's worth saying as well, I focused on the Salafi Jihadi movement, which is the Sunni part of that spectrum. But if you do look at Shia theology as well, if you look at the way Shia fighters and Shia militias are fighting in Syria and Iraq as well, then they are using the same sorts of ideas. This is a war for the future direction of Islam. This is a war for salvation of our doctrine at the end of it. So let's invest all we can, and as a result, you are seeing that happen, and the same dynamics playing out. Foreign fighters being mobilized, going out there, participating on both sides of that equation. So takfir, I say, some people, it has a sort of slight consciousness amongst people. I'm sure a lot of people in the room will have heard of it before. Al-wala wal-bara is a slightly lesser known idea. It doesn't have a straightforward translation into the English, but essentially people think of it as this doctrine of loyalty and disavowal, or love and hate for the sake of God. And again, this was principally an idea which had started out in Islam about Muslim rituals and Muslims distinguishing themselves in the Meccan society where Islam emerged from the pagan polytheistic society that was prevalent at the time. So it's about distinguishing yourself in terms of appearance, in terms of festivals. It's very much about personal conduct. And then what you began to see was, as the history of the first Saudi state, second Saudi state, and now the third, was that the idea began to take on or adopt political resonances, because tribes were suddenly beginning to use it as a doctrine of building in-group and out-group loyalties, to say, look, let's work together and go and attack these guys, or, no, don't side with those guys. It's forbidden. So you're either using it to try and build your own alliance or to weaken a coalition that's against you. So this idea of how you mobilize. Now, as I say, in the battles, the tribal battles that took place on the Arabian Peninsula for the first, second, third Saudi state, that was a very relevant concept. But once a third Saudi state is established and it takes root, the idea is kind of benched, right? You've done what you needed to do with it. So it loses its political relevance until, and I think this is a really significant moment that the literature constantly overlooks, but when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in 1990 and the subsequent dynamic that took place, this was a seismic and seminal moment in the evolution of Salafi Jihadi thinking. There is absolutely no doubt to my mind about how important this event is, but it's regularly overlooked. Because what happens at the time, of course, is that the House of Saud, the Saudi royal family, looks to the United States to come and lead a coalition to push Saddam out of Kuwait and to restore the Kuwaiti monarchy. The United States, of course, does that. It comes down, it sets up Operation Desert Storm. But this has a profound effect on Saudi society, because until that moment, there had never been political debate really in the country. There had never been open dissent. But you began to see this happen at that moment. It's worth saying I grew up in Saudi Arabia as a child, and I was about 10 when this happened. And I recall it, just as anecdotally, this was the thing that people talked about in mosques, which just never happened. The notion that the Saudi government had allowed the United States to come to the Arabian Peninsula and to establish military bases on what was regarded as holy soil. This was really an affront to lots and lots and lots of people. So that nature of the political relationship, of the political dynamic with Western powers suddenly comes into sharp relief in a way it hadn't. Because prior to that, you had civilians there, which was an issue that was not contentious at all. They'd had that discussion once they discovered oil and realized maybe it's worth getting the Americans in to drill for it. That was okay. But that was a civilian relationship. Once the relationship took on a military dimension, the dynamics changed. And a lot of literature then came out on this very question: who do we form alliances with? Okay, we don't like Saddam Hussein, but does that mean we could have a military alliance with the United States to prosecute this war? And then, of course, again, that issue roars back into focus post 9/11, when the United States needed Pakistan to go into Afghanistan to prosecute the war there as well. So the issue roars back constantly. It takes on this very, very important issue. And so, again, you find this binary distinction being adopted, even by extremist actors in the West. If you focus on, in Britain, for example, groups like Muhajirun, which existed in complete sort of polar opposite to British society, then this doctrine is how someone in that movement who can be walking around filled with hate, filled with a sense of juxtaposition to society that they're living in, how does that internally work for you? Well, it works for you in relation to this concept. The more disgusted I am with Britain, the more detached I am from Britain, then the better Muslim I'm becoming because of this principle. If you think of it on a binary spectrum, you just move from one to the other. And so it helps with the internal monologue as well. The concept of Tawheed, well, it's, as I said, it's a sort of Islam in a word, if you had to do it that way. It's a notion of monotheism. And it stems from this, or it's linked in the jihadi sense to this really interesting idea of al-qada wal-qadr, divine decree and predestination. So this comes back to the Muslim understanding of creation, or the Islamic understanding of creation. And what the Quran says is, look, when God created or began to create things, the first thing he created was the tablet and the pen. And the first command he gives is to the pen to write on the tablet. The pen says, what do I write? And God instructs it to write the history of everything. So Muslims believe that your lifespan, for example, is fixed. The moment of your birth was determined by God, and the moment of your death is determined by God. Your level of wealth, whether you were born into poverty or born into incredible riches, or whether you'll achieve incredible riches through your life or not, or these types of things, these are fixed and determined for you by God. You still have to go out and make the effort and try to find those riches, but the point is, God will determine the outcome. So, this has a very, very powerful and emancipating quality if you are a jihadist. Because to go and stand in the middle of a battlefield in Syria, for example, is a pretty crazy thing to do. But what these guys are saying is, look, the only way you can demonstrate your belief, like, yeah, God is owed many rights, right? So you have to pray. You should be praying. You should fast in Ramadan. Okay, that's the pilgrimage. But how do you demonstrate your belief in al-qada wal-qadr? How do you demonstrate your belief physically and manifest it physically in the notion that God has divine decree and predestination over all things, over your life? Well, you are just as likely to die on the streets of Montreal as you are on the streets of Raqqa or Aleppo, because God has fixed the moment for you. So if you believe that, then you have no fear in going to fight, because it doesn't matter. Death will find you. The term is appointed, as they say, right? So jihadi literature starts to use this and says, well, you can't achieve all the dimensions of Tawheed. You can't satisfy all the dimensions of Tawheed. You can't give God all his rights and all the way he's due, his rights, unless, this is part of it, you perform jihad to demonstrate that you understand clearly God controls your life, God gave you life, and God will give you death. It's also the way you keep your soldiers motivated if you're in ISIS and you're getting hammered in Mosul, and then you're getting hammered in Raqqa, and this big caliphate that you had is suddenly shrunk right down, to say, look, you have to make the effort. That is your responsibility. But the result comes from God. So he gave us this big caliphate, and now it's shrinking, but that's okay. And our comrades are dying, but that's fine too. That was determined for them. So that's okay. So you have to keep going. So it's the way they keep their morale up as well. And there is a lot. I wrote a paper actually in an academic journal about this, sort of the motivational representations of this idea in jihadi literature. And one of the ways you know is obviously when the chips are down, you then fall back on this idea to keep people going in that way. So Azam's sort of really one of the key theorists early on in the 1980s, who led the so-called Arab Mujahideen in Afghanistan, was sort of saying you can't really be a proper monotheist if you don't fight jihad. So it's very interesting to see how they put that idea together. And then the fifth of those final ideas is this idea of hakimiyya. This is achieving sovereignty for God through the political system. You could call it a caliphate, you could call it something else, but it's essentially the idea of political Islam, securing God's rights through the political order. And what's interesting is all of the previous ideas have, by and large, been shaped by political events in the Middle East and by Arab thinkers and theorists and the results of what was happening out there. But with hakimiyya, really, it's coming back to the history of the Indian subcontinent and the British experience there, and Muslims under the British Empire in the Indian subcontinent. And that chap at the top over there, Maududi, really began to theorize and think through a lot of these ideas about how that should happen. And then what happened was that Maududi's writings were translated into Arabic, where they were taken up by Qutb. And through Sayyid Qutb, they found a very large audience then in the Arab world, of course taken up as well by the Muslim Brotherhood and sort of shaped as a result of that. But the intellectual antecedents of this idea sit in the modern era, at least, in the experience of Muslims under British rule in the Indian subcontinent, and then the idea goes off from there. So that was just an interesting historical difference in terms of how this idea evolved and developed versus the other four. And as I said to you at the very start, actually, the contemporary jihadi movement says very, very little about this. So you don't find a big book on this topic from Al-Qaeda. There's no big statement or speech from bin Laden or Zawahiri or someone talking about this concept in the way that, as I say, groups like the Brotherhood and others have dedicated a lot of time to. And I think partly it's because, as I say, it lacks that immediacy for battlefield relevance, and partly because I think they also think, well, this debate's largely settled. Right? There's support broadly in some shape or form for this concept, for this idea, so we're kind of happy to leave that there. What we've really got to sell is takfir, because that's justifying what we're doing on the ground here. So I think that that's part of the thinking. So I'll just move into very quickly discussing the sort of broader context, and then the three points. I'm conscious of time, so I'll sort of ensure there's enough for Q&A. Salafi Jihadism, to my mind, is, as I say, a relatively new term. There have been jihadis before who've happened to be Salafis, but it's not the same as Salafi Jihadism in the sense that an identifiable ideology, a sort of codified ideological belief, I think really came about as a product of the 2003 invasion of Iraq. That's when the group really pumped out a lot of material in a sort of fairly systematic fashion to try and bring on board a sort of Arab and more broadly Muslim world that of course was deeply opposed to that war, but that therefore they felt they could win over to their doctrine. And what they realized was, given the particularly barbaric and brutal manner in which they were fighting that war, they were losing that audience. And so they were trying to communicate with them, to keep them on board, to win them back, and to try and do that. So just to give it a bit of context as well, in terms of how the contemporary jihadi movement does this. Well, the contemporary jihadi movement takes a very highly politicized reading and understanding of the Prophet's life, of the Prophet's experiences, and then uses that to shape what they're doing. This is part of, as I say, explaining why they prioritize winning land, establishing themselves on that land, and to have some sort of authority. And it's a notion that the Prophet is in Mecca at the start of Islam and is there for 13 years, and then after that point migrates to Medina. So you have the first 13 years of Islam happening in Mecca, and then it moves out to Medina. This is known as the Hijrah, or the migration. And there's lots of different kinds, if you look at Islamic literature, of discussions about Hijrah, a physical Hijrah, spiritual Hijrah, these types of things. Now, most Muslims regard it as a migration from persecution. They were being persecuted in Mecca, they were outnumbered, and they were outmatched. And so it made sense to get out of that environment because it was not a conducive environment for them. But the jihadi movement says no. This is really about establishing political authority for Islam. The move wasn't about persecution, it wasn't about sort of safety or safeguarding, it was fundamentally about politics, and it was about establishing a political authority, a so-called Islamic state. And that again is a wide debate when you look at the literature about what was this move, and was the move to Medina essentially the creation of the first Islamic state. And just to give you a sort of quick thing on this, so Muslims believe, and again when you look at radical literature you see their understanding going this way. Muslims believe that the Quran was revealed piecemeal over a 23-year period. Now if you look at those first 13 years of scripture, of revelation in Mecca, then what you get is a fairly abstract discussion happening there. The concepts being discussed are monotheism, the afterlife, personal moral conduct, that kind of thing. Once the move to Medina happens, the nature of the verses change. They're much more political in nature. The rules on jihad and war come at that time. Rules on inheritance and economics, all these things start to emerge in the Medinan phase, not in the first phase. So in the first 13 years of Islam, there is no concept of jihad. Jihad doesn't exist at that point. It comes after that move to Medina. And the reason for giving you that background is you may know about, and if you don't, it's worth looking him up, this guy Anwar al-Awlaki. He was a very prominent a member of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. He was killed ultimately in a drone strike, but he'd lived in the United States prior to September the 11th. He spoke very good English, was very charismatic, and that's what made him so potent as a recruiter, as a mobilizer, and as an operational character within that movement, and he led a lot of things. Now, what's important to understanding the way they view it is, look, when you read this, right, he says, when the Messenger of Allah was given the dawah, so he's given the call, when he's proselytizing in Mecca for 13 years, only a few hundred people became Muslim. When he made the hijrah to Medina, within 10 years, over 100,000 became Muslim. So how come the dawah in Medina was much more fruitful than the dawah in Mecca? That was because he was using a superior form of dawah in Medina. That is the dawah of the sword. So again, if you're a jihadist or you're a member of Al-Qaeda, then these constructions of history, these interpretations of the historical record are really important to what you're doing. And that's fundamentally what I was trying to do with the research, was to understand how they see these things. What is their construction of history and interpretation of it? What is their construction of the texts? And what is, again, their references to this? So again, when I do this with my students, we take, these are very contested terms, but it's important to see them from their perspective. If we see it from their perspective, we get their worldview, their narrative and mantra on what is happening. So the three really interesting sort of subheadings under their sort of concept of jihad are as follows. Now, Qisas is one interesting point, which I say is a law of equal retaliation, sort of broadly comparable with the Christian concept of an eye for an eye lex talionis in that way. And Qisas principally relates to case of personal injury offense, right? So murder, manslaughter, physical mutilation. If I lose my arm because of a drunk driver who happens to knock me over, then this would be the mechanism through which I would look to get some justice for myself, or, of course, in the event of murder, for my family member who's been murdered by some individual in that way. Now, Qisas sits as one of the broader parts of the Islamic Penal Code. There are three parts of the Islamic Penal Code. There's the hudud. These are the sort of famous things that people tend to know about. These are where God, or the punishment and the offense is stipulated in Scripture. So it's such as chopping the hand of a thief, lashes for consumption of alcohol, that kind of thing. Conservative Muslims believe, obviously, that the hudud cannot be squared away because God set what the crime was and God set the punishment. So it's not in your purview to forgive it, to forgive that offense or to squirrel it away. So again, that's a very contentious and debated thing in the Muslim world. What is the role of the hudud? How are the hudud constructed? Where do they sit? And so on. But as I say, that's sort of regarded as being the more unbending part because it's regarded as divine. You have the ta'zir, which is completely discretionary. Okay, it's just something that's allowed where man could legislate. So what is the speed limit going to be on the highway? Well, obviously the scripture's silent on that. There's nothing, but you can set that. That's in your discretionary power. But the qisas, as I say, is, I think, under a common law system, what you might regard as tort law, essentially. It's about personal injury, and it's about claims in that concept. So what does Al-Qaeda begin to do when it talks about this? Well, they take that notion and they apply it to people to nations rather than to people. They elevate it to a tool of international affairs. So whereas Qisas traditionally applies where the perpetrator of the crime or injustice is known, that's how it traditionally functions. So that if you came and murdered a member of my family and the police catch you, that's the obvious point of reference. But you wouldn't visit a punishment upon your siblings or your broader family. It's on the individual themselves. But what Al-Qaeda begins to say is no, actually it doesn't matter in that sense. You can go after the government. And the government means going after the whole society. So you go after cases in a generalized way and in an unspecified manner. So if your civilian area gets bombed in Afghanistan or Syria, then that justifies letting off a bomb in a major urban center, Western capital, for example, in that way. So they say, look, it's an eye for an eye. We're retaliating. We're coming back in this way. And the leader, the founding leader really of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, Yusuf al-Uyayri, said, but utilizing this principle, he said, it would be perfectly permissible for us to kill around 10 million American civilians. So that was his theorizing of the concept, to say these are supposedly the litany of abuses America has committed in the Muslim world against Muslims. Therefore, under principles of Qisas, we can come back and retaliate in that way. So Qisas stipulates the eye for an eye part, but not the method. And Al-Qaeda basically says that you can use any means possible, provided it's the act itself is allowed with the Sharia. So you don't have to respond like for like. You can respond in any way. And what they began to do, and what a lot of their theorists tried to find a framework for, was to justify the use of WMD. To say, if we got our hands on a chemical weapon, on a nuclear device or something, would it be justified to use it? And of course, you won't be surprised to find out that they reasoned they could use it if they got their hands on it. And this guy, Nasser al-Fahad, who's again in jail now, theorized and wrote a book or a small pamphlet really on what that use should look like, what the circumstance in terms of trade of WMD use would be. And again, Osama bin Laden pointed to America's use of WMD during the Second World War, firstly he said, look, did their bombs distinguish between civilians and military actors? They didn't. By the laws of equivalence, we can do the same, and we will use this in order to strike back. So that was a lot of the sort of background, you could say, to justifying and rationalizing in their mind attacks like September the 11th, or the 7/7 bombings in London, or the Madrid bombings, or things like that. It's this principle of equivalence and qisas. Again, Islamic State's various attacks in Europe in particular, France, November 2015, that kind of thing, is justified with reference to this concept. This is the principle, the intellectual framework that sits behind some of those attacks. Just to peel it back, it was really the Algerian Civil War where this emerged first. You see it being used and utilized in a military sense, not being used in the sort of traditional legal way, but elevated, as I say, to a tool of international relations in the Algerian Civil War with the GIA. Again, it was really in response to France and French involvement there. Then this guy, Abu Musab al-Suri, told them to attack the French, saying it was valid. And then you had, as I say, the hijacking of Air France in 1994 and a small bombing campaign across Paris throughout 1995 as well. So that's the first time you see it being elevated and used in that way, or weaponized by them in that way. As I mentioned before, there is dissent within the movement, and you do see that here with some theorists who are saying, look, you can't do this. You can't go after generalized groups of people under Qisas. So yes, if a government bombs you and you attack that government's parliament, or you attack the residence of the president, prime minister, whatever it is, that's okay. But just to let off a bomb in a street or a marketplace is unacceptable. So even within the jihadi movement, there is debate about targeting or the validity of targeting and that kind of thing you do see in that way. Again, who is targeted? So children are regarded as protected, so you can't go after children. Again, WMD being another very contentious point that is debated within the movement. The other way in which they reason and rationalize civilian casualties is the principle of vicarious liability. And what they are essentially saying is that in the West, there is this contractual relationship between the rulers and the ruled, between individuals and their governments through taxation, that we fund our governments, but also through the fact that there is this electoral process, and therefore, in theory at least, our leaders are accountable to us and serve the interests of the people, I'd say, at least in the most sort of theoretical concept. So Osama bin Laden says the American people have the ability and choice to refuse the policies of their government and even to change it if they want. All Americans are our enemies, not just the ones who fight us directly, but also the ones who pay their taxes. So just by virtue of existing in that system, even if you were unemployed and therefore paying no tax and completely politically disengaged and you hated everything the government stood for, by virtue of being an American citizen who has the ability to engage, then that legitimizes your targeting under this principle, because you are carrying through vicarious liability the burden of the actions of the government at which they regard themselves to be at war with. So this is a slight detour, but again, the language and discussion is very, very interesting in that sense about who can you go after, how do you go after them, and they use these very, very broad and vague words such as protected persons can be killed. So even if it's wrong to go after someone under traditional understandings, they would say, well, if you're engaged in the fight, then you can go after a person. And engaged in the fight can be done through words and acts, and there's essentially you're a taxpayer, therefore you are a legitimate target. So I'll just finish with this, and then I think hopefully there'll be 10, 15 minutes for some questions. Another big discussion is human shields, and it's not how we would think of human shields or how it, what the term necessarily means in the English language. It's really about collateral damage. So again, if you're Al-Qaeda and you're letting off a bomb in a marketplace because there's a dignitary, a government official, member of cabinet, whatever, walking through, you accept there's probably going to be other casualties as well. So you need to find a way to justify that to your followers, to try and pacify your supporters, but also in your own internal monologue to keep yourself driven by this notion that this is what God really wants you to be doing. You have to find a way to explain this. So it's really the framework of considering collateral damage or civilian casualties in war. So they go back to episodes from the life of the Prophet Muhammad. Again, as I said, take these very politicized readings of his life and says, look, there was this siege of Taif and a subsequent battle where this catapult was used to essentially overrun the defenses of this town. Now, the catapult is a crude device. It's not distinguishing between civilians and combatants. It's just being used in that concept. The same thing with night raids on enemy tribes, as was common. And they were asked, well, what if women, children, the elderly come out and says they are from them? So again, utilizing jihadi literature, these two incidents to justify things. But there's a lot of broader discussion. A lot of Islamic scholars actually say there was no catapult used in Taif, so this example is concocted and doesn't have strength. Another example looks at this issue, well, what about the women, children, elderly? It's saying, even if this was the case, which it may have been, it's again debated, but what Imam Shafi is saying in his text is, look, even if this was the case, there's this principle of negation that exists with or abrogation that exists within Islamic scripture, which is later revelation can prohibit something that was allowed at the start. So the very famous example of this is that alcohol and consumption of alcohol was allowed for Muslims. In the first 13 years in Mecca, you could get drunk and be a Muslim. That was okay. And then it was later abrogated that actually no. And it was abrogated in stages. So then it was like, don't come to prayers drunk, and then a sort of complete prohibition. So this principle exists. So he's saying, look, even if the targeting of women, children, and the elderly was something that was sanctioned in earlier stages, it was later abrogated. You need to rein it in. Of course, the Salafi Jihadi movement takes a very interesting view on this. And this book, Tatarrus fi Jihad al-Mu'asir, Tatarrus, or the concept of human shields in the modern jihad, comes out in reaction to the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Now, what's interesting is Al-Qaeda normally, when it's engaging in the debate, says, you've got it wrong. You didn't understand the scripture properly, or you didn't understand this episode. And with some of the examples I've given you, they construct particular readings and interpretations of historical events or precedents that suit their worldview or interpretation. So highly politicized readings of things, that kind of thing. What this book actually does is it says all of the classical opinions on the barriers to killing human shields, to minimize all these casualties, are correct. So it starts on that premise, which actually, if you start on that, Al-Qaeda can't do a lot of what it wants to do. So it's saying, you're right, we can't do these things. All these things apply. But then he uses two theological principles to get around this. And the main issue is this idea of necessity. He says, look, we have to fight the enemy. That's a necessity. By fighting the enemy, we're protecting the whole religion. And the defense of the religion is the most important thing. So therefore, this can outweigh things. So this is called the jurisprudence of balances, fiqh al-muwazanat. And he's saying we take this principle and we conclude that jihad outweighs, or the necessity of fighting jihad, the need to fight it, outweighs the harms of killing civilians. So you see how subjective it becomes, which is where this becomes very, very interesting. This idea is all very divine, but actually subject to huge subjective reasoning. And the second point, he says, look, this is just the reality of modern warfare. The classical opinions and rulings apply to times where people were fighting with very different weapons. We are fighting as non-state actors with fairly crude weapons, but that have this fairly destructive quality to them. So it just needs to be that way. And also, society is now much more mixed than they used to be. It wasn't like the old days where you go out and you fight battles somewhere between different warring tribes. This is an urban guerrilla campaign that we're conducting in Iraq. That's the reality of it. Therefore, reality merged with necessity allows us to do what we're doing. It justifies and explains our behaviors in that way. So what they're really saying is what holds them back and what allows them to do whatever they're doing is intention. We didn't intend to kill these people. They weren't the root sort of aim of what we were trying to do. Therefore, if we let off this bomb next to a government building in order to kill the members of parliament inside, but a school bus happens to drive by at that moment and all the children die as well, well, that wasn't our intention, therefore God won't hold us responsible. And in any event, really, it's not us killing them, it's God who brought them there at that time. So it wasn't really our fault, in essence. It's worth saying, even the Salafi Jihadi movement didn't start out at this point. Traditionally, they were very critical of going after civilians. You didn't see in Afghanistan in the 1980s, for example, journalists being kidnapped, hijackings, that kind of thing. And then you did see within the movement itself theorists who were important within Al-Qaeda, also turning their backs on what the group had done in terms of its fairly promiscuous embrace or fairly high threshold and capacity for tolerating civilian casualties. They said, look, that needs to stop, essentially, in that way. So that was a sort of quick whistle-stop tour of the essential components of Jihadi Salafi belief and its relationship with violence. Those are my details on the right if you need to get in touch. But otherwise, I'm happy to open it up to Q&A.